I will reveal later. President Mbeki, would you like to respond to some of these questions, some or all? I can summarize for you, but I don't think...
Yeah, I hope I heard all of them.
Yeah, if you miss important one out.
You will, okay.
I've taken the platform.
With regard to these the questions on the Congo, I have absolutely no doubt that Rwanda is very keenly interested in what's happening in the Congo for two reasons. One of them is the one we've been talking about, which is the presence of a Rwandan-speaking population on the Congo, in the Congo, which is a matter of the drawing of the colonial borders. The colonial masters draw a line, and some Rwandan-speaking people are on this side of that line and that side of the line. I think it would be unnatural for Rwanda not to be interested in what's happening to the Rwandan-speaking people across the border. Secondly, as we all know, some of the people who committed genocide in Rwanda in 1994 ran into the Eastern Congo, where they still are to this day. The FDLR, who say that one of their tasks is to overthrow the government of Rwanda. That's the second reason that Rwanda would be interested in the Congo. So I have absolutely no doubt that the Rwanda is very interested in what's happening in the Eastern Congo. What they do practically in terms of interventions and so on, I don't know. Except in instances where the government in Kinshasa is actually authorized that the Rwandan army can come in to deal with the FDLR. I haven't heard of any other ethnic group in the Congo which has suffered the same fate as the Tutsi population in the Eastern Congo. One of the colleagues was saying, what about the other ethnic groups? I haven't heard. I'm not Congolese, maybe the Congolese would know better than I do, of any other ethnic group that has suffered the same fate, as a consequence of which it takes a decision that it must protect itself. The EU, the question we mentioned about the EU and what the EU does towards Rwanda, I'm sure is correct. I've heard of other countries taking what particular posture towards Rwanda. The basic question I'm raising is that you will not solve the problem, the conflict of the Congo, unless you deal fundamentally with this domestic issue. When the Congolese met here and sat in Sun City and negotiated the Sun City Agreement, this was part of the discussion. The Congolese colleagues will remember that one of the formations that participated in the Sun City dialogue was an armed organization called the RCD. The RCD, sometimes people call it the Goma RCD. The RCD essentially represented that Banyamulenge population, accepted in these negotiations as part of the Congo. He participated in negotiations, and some of the decisions taken in the inter-Congolese dialogue were about the proper integration of that Banyamulenge population in the army, in government, and so on. You would find there's a resolution out of the inter-Congolese dialogue which deals with the issue of national minorities. The formal resolution at Sun City, the reason that that resolution was adopted was to deal with this question. So I'm saying the Congolese, when they met together, they recognized this problem exactly for what it is and dealt with it. And I'm quite sure that was also reflected in the constitution that was then decided upon based on the Sun City outcomes. Essentially, if we are genuinely interested in, well, let me just finish that story. After the Sun City negotiations concluded, and the Congolese took a particular position, the positions I'm explaining, this is how we are going to deal with ourselves as Congolese about our country. As I say, reflected in the Constitution. We then thought it was also necessary to deal with this issue of the relationship between the DRC and Rwanda. So we hosted negotiations here in this city between President Joseph Kabila and President Paul Kagame. And we're saying to them, the Congolese have taken a particular position about how to sort out their own problems. You need to contribute to that as countries which neighbor each other. So they signed an agreement. And one of those agreements, the issues decided in that agreement was the government of the Congo would act to disarm the FDLR. Another part of that was Rwanda would withdraw its troops from the DRC. I'm sure you'd find that agreement on the internet, signed by the two presidents, because in our view, it was important both to solve this problem of the conflict among the Congolese by the Congolese, but it was also important that the neighborhood contributes to that solution. And that was why that agreement was signed. It didn't work. And the reason it didn't work was because in reality, the DRC government did not have the capacity to disarm the FDLR. So if you are on the Rwandan side of the borderline, you would say, but the FDLR problem has not been solved in terms of the signed agreement. Those are some of the realities here. We can go into more of these realities about that situation, but fundamentally, to resolve the conflict in the Congo, we've got to go back to the Congolese and say, what did you agree at Sun City? What did you put in your constitution as a result? What have you done about the things about which you agreed? I think that's what would help us to solve this problem. The matter of historically, the ANC has a relationship with the Palestinians, particularly through the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Both these organizations were allies because they were confronted, they were both engaged in a struggle for national liberation. With the Palestinians involved in a struggle, recognizes it's in the United Nations decisions. the very first decision of the United Nations General Assembly 1947, dealing with the creation of the two states, Jewish state, Palestinian state. This Palestinian state has not existed since then, to this day. The vision adopted by the United Nations I'm saying in 1947, when they took this decision to form the state of Israel, this idea of the formation of a Palestinian state is there. It's never happened. And indeed, the conditions, now, my view, the conditions for the establishment of this Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank and so on, those conditions have become eroded by the behavior of the Israeli government. The settlements on the West Bank, for instance, have taken away a lot of the land which had been part of that Palestinian state. I'm saying, therefore, that it was not a surprise that the South African government would take a position in defense of the Palestinians and criticize whatever the government of Israel was doing. Some years back, when I was still in government, we hosted a bilateral meeting between the Israelis and the Palestinians in a wine estate somewhere in the Western Cape. We sat with them for days to say, as representatives of these two communities, let's find a solution. And when there were military questions they were asking, we called in our National Defense Force to say, please help. If there were police matters, we'd call in the police service to say, please help. Because we were trying very hard to get these two to agree on how to settle this problem. So our intervention on this matter, it doesn't start with the case in the International Court of Justice. We've had prime ministers of Israel Ehud Barak, before he became prime minister, came here. We discussed with him. The prime minister of Israel was assassinated, Yitzhak Shamir. We were in contact with him. After the decision taken in Oslo, which led to the birth of the Palestinian Authority, he was in touch with us to say this is what they've agreed. And he personally was very committed to make sure that these things happens. Because we have to solve this problem of the relations between the Israelis, the Jewish population, and the Palestinians. And therefore, the matter of the Palestinian state was very important, which is why he was assassinated. We're engaged with them. I'm saying that we are not new to this question. And consistently, what we have sought is to encourage an agreement between these two sides, so that indeed what was visualized in the 1947 resolution of the General Assembly is accomplished. And therefore, I don't think our attitude with regard to the matter of a just resolution of the conflict, which must address the fundamental interest of the Palestinian people, in the same way that the protection of the Israel and so on is also very important, our positions on those things won't change. So in practical sense, even if South Africa decided that they're withdrawing their intervention in the ICJ, that won't end the case. That case is already with the International Court of Justice, and the Court of Justice will proceed with what it has to do. But fundamentally, I'm saying that You know, the positions we've taken over many years on the Palestinian question, the same positions as when President Clinton was there, President Bush was there, Bush Senior, Bush Junior, President Trump when he was in the first term, the same positions. And I'm sure that we are not going to change those positions. And indeed, I think everybody, all of us need to join hands to say the rights of the Palestinian people must be respected. I really don't know what anybody expects South Africa to do with regard to Zimbabwe. After the elections in Zimbabwe, I can't remember now the exact year, but there were elections, presidential elections, when you had something like 22 or 23 presidential candidates. What year was that? And then you have these elections, and President Mnangagwa is elected president of Zimbabwe. He then called on all of the parties which had presented presidential candidates to come together to form some kind of political collective to discuss the future of Zimbabwe. And indeed, that formation emerged. The weakness with it was that some of the parties that had candidates did not participate. One of the results of that particular presidential election was that there were two of the candidates who, between the two of them, got 95% of the votes. It's the President Emerson Mnangagwa and Nelson Chamisa. Between the two of them, they had 95% of the presidential vote. The other 21 parties shared the other 5%. So this formation that President Mnangagwa called for, parties that had the candidates must come together. Chamisa's party did not participate, plus 1 or 2 or 3, 4 others. So now one of the demands that is being put forward by Zimbabwe, correctly, is the lifting of sanctions that have been imposed on Zimbabwe to create better space for the Zimbabweans to address their own development challenges. Particularly in sanctions imposed by the United States. So, I know many of the players, political players in Zimbabwe. So I went to see President Mnangagwa to say to him, President, I agree. We need these sanctions lifted. But part of what needs to happen, is that you Zimbabweans need to speak with one voice. Our colleague also raised this question about the need for Africa to make sure that it works as a bloc, to say that you as Zimbabweans need to speak with one voice on this matter, apart from any other consideration. And therefore, it seemed to me that one of the things that needs to happen is that these two parties, which had 95% of the presidential votes, need to get together to talk about the future of Zimbabwe. So that even on this matter, when we approach the rest of the world to say lift sanctions, it must be said by both. Agreed. We agreed. Just get together and sort out these problems. And to cut a long story short, that meeting never took place. I don't know if it's still relevant now, that kind of approach. But we were intervening as South Africans, as good neighbors, to say from our reading of the situation in Zimbabwe, this is what we thought we should do. I'm saying it did not produce any results. I don't know now what would be expected of South Africa with regard to Zimbabwe. I'm quite certain that the Zimbabweans themselves are very much aware of the fact that they need to get together as Zimbabweans to discuss whatever it is that constitute the fundamental problems facing the country. And I think indeed the Zimbabweans must be given space to do that themselves. I don't know specifically, the question that is raised very specifically, whether our government or the GNU has done the things that were recommended by the GNU, by the New Joint Commission on the South African Revenue Service. I really honestly don't know whether any of those things have been done. But the point I want to make with regard to that is the larger question I was raising about the New Joint Commission report is this. That commission makes a very critically important statement about South Africa. And that statement is that there's a group of people in our country who are very, very determined to make sure that the democratic experiment fails. And they intervened in this matter of SARS to make sure that you cut down the revenues that are available to the state so that it can pay civil servants, it can pay the army, it can pay the... It would collapse. And that's what New Joint demonstrates practically, what was done. And indeed, the reason the New Joint Commission was appointed was exactly because the revenues accruing to the states were diminishing because of the success of that intervention. That's what rang the alarm bells. This South African Revenue Service, which is so efficient in the past, what has all of a sudden very inefficient. Smaller and smaller revenues accruing to the state because of a conscious intervention to destroy the South African Revenue Service. I'm saying that the New Joint Commission report points to this reality of the intervention of the counter-revolution in this country to destroy the democratic experiment. And there are other interventions that it made. With it, part of the reason we've got this economic crisis and so on. The reason, for instance, you have the failure of the state corporations. This story that is told is because of deployment of comrades to positions because they have no qualifications, but they are cadres. It's wrong. The destruction of the state corporations was a systematic process done by exactly the same people who intervened in SARS, as New Joint explains. And that problem persists. And part of what concerns me is that it seems to me many of our people are not listening. For instance, last year, we said, given the problems our country faces, we need a national dialogue. Meaning a national dialogue that let the people of South Africa come together and say, this is the South Africa we want, this is the South Africa we don't want. Without mediation of political parties or anything. Let the people themselves talk and determine their own destiny. I thought the matter was agreed. I think it's even in the documents of the GNU, we agree. But nothing is moving. Why? Because there are people who don't want that national dialogue to take place. It's because they've got their own agenda for South Africa, which is very, very different from the agenda that would come from the people of South Africa speaking for themselves. So today, many people ask, but President, you called for this thing months ago, and it was agreed. Why is nothing moving? I'm saying nothing is moving because, my view, there are other people who don't want it to happen. And I'm hoping that this matter will get sorted out. The lessons from the New Gent Commission indeed are about the specific amendments to changes to the SARS Act and all that is mentioned. But more fundamental is that we must confront this reality that there were people in this country who don't want this democracy to succeed. And they intervened in very specific ways, like spelled out in the SARS New Gent Commission, in order to make sure this democracy fails. And I'm hoping that what was visualized as a national dialogue does not fall victim to that kind of negative intervention. Indeed, I must say that when I've at some point spoken about some of the issues raised by some of our Afrikaner compatriots when they talk about alienation in the society, I've said the best place to discuss those matters is in the national dialogue. Instead of people going to Washington to say you are being whatever, they must come to the national dialogue and make that presentation. And so that we, as all of us as South Africans, we can then discuss that. If you say my cultural rights as an African are being denied, say it in the national dialogue and produces evidence so that all of us as South Africans can then say, well, what is to be done? Because the answer to the question what is to be done will not come from Washington. It must come from here. So during the negotiations, we addressed, as the colleague would know, in a very, very detailed manner, this demand for a folk state. It was addressed in a very comprehensive manner. It includes, for instance, with regard to the elections in 1994, based on the 1993 Constitution, there's an agreement that part of the results of those elections would be used in order to assess whether objectively conditions exist for the establishment of a folk state. It's a specific agreement. Elections took place, and everybody agreed, including the Afrikaners, that the election results, the voice of the people of South Africa, black and white, said there's no place for a folk state. There was no way you could, there was no way you could say this particular area is a folk state. So I'm saying the matter was raised, was discussed. The demand for Afrikaner self-determination, which was very much part of those negotiations. That matter was discussed, was negotiated, as a result of which there's actually a constitutional provision which provides for self-determination for all of the people of South Africa, not just Afrikaners. So the matter was addressed. That's what I'm saying, that if there is anybody among the Afrikaner community who still thinks there's a problem, the place to discuss this is in national dialogue. The danger with the position that is being taken, as reflected in what seems to have been said in the United States, is that you create a situation where the suggestion is the country must not undertake this task of the eradication of the legacy of colonialism and apartheid. Because if you do that, you threaten Afrikaner interests. You can't say we must not act to change the country away from that past in order to preserve what is said to be rights of the Afrikaners. You can't say that. I'm saying the danger of it is that you then, if you take this particular group of white South Africans and they set themselves aside, they've got particular interests which must block change in South Africa. You are creating conditions of mutual hostility. The black oppressed will say, you want us to continue to live with this heritage of apartheid and colonialism, and you maintain whatever advantage you had as a result of that system. That's unsustainable. It's very, very dangerous to create a situation where there might be conflict of that kind. And yet I'm saying that the place is there for these problems to be addressed by South Africans as a whole. And national dialogue must include the possibility for these Afrikaners, like anybody else, to come and present their own case. And let us as South Africans together discuss those. The GNU is our government. Whatever we think of it, it's a government. And as the government, it must help to solve the problems that are facing the country. We've got huge levels of unemployment. We've got huge levels of poverty, a very stark situation of racial inequalities, gender inequalities. Those are real problems. And this only government we have, the GNU, must address those issues. Whether it can, I don't know. But it's got an obligation. If it says we are the government of South Africa, what's the government of South Africa do? Government of South Africa must address those issues. The issue of combating inflation, clearly the colleague is correct. It can't just be a matter of the Reserve Bank moving interest rates up and down. It fundamentally is a question that we were raising earlier when the matter about VAT and fiscal matters was raised. We've got to attend to this problem, that effectively the South African economy is stagnant. Whether it's growing annually at 0.8 or something, effectively stagnant. What that means, proportionately, is that our people are getting poorer every day. Critically, the matter of the regeneration of the South African economy becomes important. And this happened in the past. The statisticians, for instance, will say at some point, maybe 2004, 2005, 2006, thereabouts, this economy was growing at the rate of about 5% a year. It was under an ANC government. So the argument that we are incapable of managing a modern economy is nonsense. The things that must be done, the things that must be done about the economy must be done. I was saying earlier, we can't avoid the notion, the implementation of the concept of a social compact. That is part of what needs to be done in order to address the issue of inflation. I should have acknowledged also Our Lady, the beekeeper. Maybe that's one of the ways of addressing inflation, is to produce honey. In terms of our diplomacy, so we can't be beggars. South Africa cannot behave as a beggar under any circumstance. We've got to engage whoever we have to engage, but not in the sense of coming to beg anybody. We have a population here which is not used to begging. This population which fought to defeat the apartheid regime, it did not beg. People are ready to sacrifice their lives in order to bring about change. So if you had a government that went to this population to say we're going to beg somebody else for something, they would never understand what you are talking about. So the question that's raised by two of our colleagues, how does one become an agent for change? I've got this particular specialization. I'm very interested in matters about food security. I'm an accountant. I've got that particular skill, but I should not just earn a salary. But this skill must help to change the government, to change the country for the better. What do I need to do in order to intervene to change this country for the better? In food security, accountancy, whatever. I would say to, fortunately, in the hall we have the chairperson of council of UNISA and the vice chancellor and principal. For the students of UNISA, they must pose those questions to those two. We've got the skills. We want to make a positive impact on the transformation of our society. How do we do that? That's a question. And I'm sure the university would help to answer that question. To see how its own students, its own graduates, they intervene to change this country for the better. I think that's a matter that also needs to be addressed by our political parties. So I can only speak not on behalf, but as a member of one of the political parties. In our case, I think we're so preoccupied with what to do with ourselves that I doubt if we would have time to address that question. But it's a question that must be addressed even by the political parties. What is it that they suggest should be done by these South Africans who are very ready to act as agents of change? So I'm not answering that question myself, because I think there are other people who are better empowered to do that. Anthony, that's all the questions.